So the river of striving, let's just talk about it a little bit in chapter 11. A lot of details given here. What it does is it looks at the Persian Empire, projects out 3 kings, and then says the 4th king, verse 2 of chapter 11, will gain far more riches. And so we see men trying to get riches, trying to get power, trying to get military equipment, trying to get bigger armies. We keep seeing that repeated. That's the character of man in the flesh in rebellion against God. The 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece. So this is Xerxes I of Persia. He attacks Greece in 480 BC. He fails at that. And a mighty king, verse 3, will arise. This is Alexander the Great. So a mighty king, he indeed told his troops, listen, we need to attack the Persians so they don't attack us. And so it was still a retaliation, even though it was 150 years later in 334 BC when he attacked into Asia Minor and then ultimately conquered Darius in 3 major battles against the Persian Empire. So a mighty king will arise. He will rule with great authority to do as he pleases. Basically in 3 years conquers the Persian Empire. He dies young though in 323 BC. So it says as soon as he has arisen, basically he just conquered the whole Persian Empire, he's kind of setting up shop and he dies. His kingdom will be broke up and parceled out. We had heard about him earlier in Daniel chapter 8, the bighorn that was broken off. His kingdom will be broken up and parceled out. This is exactly what happened. Here he had become so dominant, Macedon he called it, because he was Macedonian, north of Greece, and he had conquered everything, but then it just gets splintered up in no time. And so the next power-seeking, self-seeking, self-willed men come along. And so there's Perdiccas, and there's Antigonus, and there's Eumenes, and they fight until Antiochus is 80 years old when he's killed in battle at Ipsus in 301. So for 20 years, 22 years, they're fighting with each other, striving. Seleucus, killed Perdiccas. He was one of the generals. He had gone to Babylonia, but then got concerned about Antigonus, so he flees to Egypt and is under Ptolemy I in Egypt. And then eventually goes back to Babylon, gets a strong army, and helps at Ipsus in 301 up in Asia Minor. And that stops Antigonus, and basically it gets divided into 4 major parts. There's Macedonia, Thrace, the Seleucid Empire under Seleucus, which was most of Asia Minor, over in the Syria as his hub, out into the east as well, Babylonia and Persia. And then the Ptolemies down in Egypt, up into Judea, Syria, actually disputed territory there between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, which is what's going to be talked about here between the king of the north and the king of the south. So it says, verse 4, as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, not according to his authority, which he wielded, because his sovereignty be removed and given to others besides them. And so we kind of sometimes think some great things about Alexander the Great, but it sure didn't last very long. I'm thankful that the kingdom of our God and of his Christ is going to last forever once that gets established. But it's going to keep going on here with men striving. Verse 5 says, then the king of the south, so that's Ptolemy I, will grow strong along with one of his princes, that's Seleucus I, because he had been down in Egypt with him to start with, who will gain ascendancy over him. He actually got a much larger kingdom than him when he established the Seleucid Empire, and rule. His domain will be a great realm indeed. It was the largest of the 4. And after some years, so this projects forward, it skips over his son, Antiochus I. It projects forward to this alliance, marriage alliance, kind of showing the intrigue and the self-will of man in this particular example, jumping out to about 250 BC. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, so this Berenike is the daughter of the king of the south, Ptolemy II, is given to the king of the north, who's Antiochus II at that time, to reach an agreement. But she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who fathered her, as well as he who supported her in those times. So when Antiochus II wanted to take Berenike in this marriage alliance, he divorced Laodike, his wife that he currently have. Laodike didn't take that well, and eventually when she has the opportunity, she murders or has murdered Antiochus II, Berenike, and Berenike's son. All of them killed. Well, Ptolemy III, who's Berenike's brother doesn't take that very well. He comes and he invades, verse 7. But one of the descendants of her line will arise, that's Ptolemy 3, one of the descendants of her line will arise in his, Ptolemy 2's place, and he, Ptolemy 3, will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. So that's Seleucia, which was the fortress town, the port town for Antioch, which was created by Seleucus I. So we'll enter the fortress of the king of the north. He actually takes that port town that they had established where Seleucus actually had been buried, and he will deal with them and prevail. He'll actually conquer all the way over into Babylonia. And he will also take into captivity to Egypt their gods with their cast metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. He goes back to Egypt. Then the latter, this is Seleucus II, will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land, apparently planning a naval battle, but hits a storm and so has to go back. Now it jumps out to Seleucus II's sons, so Seleucus III and Antiochus III, and his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow. Seleucus III was murdered by his own troops, so Antiochus III, who's called Antiochus the Great, takes charge. Now he's going to be an important figure here because it's under him that Jerusalem first gets touched. So we have the river flowing of men striving, and Antiochus III is going to continue that striving. He's going to pass through. He'll again wage war up to his fortress. So he takes Seleucia back, and the king of the south will be enraged. He's conquering down into Syria and into Judea. He gets down, getting pretty close to Egypt, and finally the Ptolemy IV, who really loved pleasure and ease, didn't want to be fighting with battle. He just loved luxury. Finally, he'll be enraged and go out and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be handed over to the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be haughty, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall. So this is referring to Raphia, where Ptolemy IV just obliterates Antiochus III's army. Yet he will not prevail because he's not going to bother to keep him going and trying to conquer more, because he wants to go back and just relax and have fun and live in debauchery. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude, verse 13, than the former. So Antiochus III actually goes out and fights out in the east, in Babylonia, etc., and in doing so develops a very large army, a greater multitude than the former. And after an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. So there was a multitude, then there's a great multitude, and now there's a greater multitude, because this is how you do things when you're just doing things in the flesh. We don't have God in view. The people that know their God will be strong and take action, do exploits, it's going to say later in this chapter. But this person doesn't know their God. He's just thinking about what he can see, what he can get his hand on, and how he can be strong in himself. Now in those times, verse 14, many will rise up against the king of the south. So in fighting at Raphia, they had trained the native Egyptians and for battle, which they didn't do before that, and they kind of reap what they sowed, because now the native Egyptians rise up against them. But it's not just them. It says the valiant ones among your people, so the people of Israel, Daniel's people, will also raise themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. So during this time when Antiochus III is invading again down towards Egypt, people in Jerusalem who are really unfaithful to the Lord, the ones that have submitted to Hellenization, falling with the Greek way of culture and disobedient to the Lord in many ways, they welcome Antiochus III. So this is a shift then from the Ptolemies ruling Jerusalem to now the Seleucid Empire ruling Jerusalem. And initially it actually seems to go pretty well for them. Antiochus III actually supports tax exemption for the construction of the temple. And so it seems to go well, this conforming, this falling, and this compromising. But they're going to find in the long run, when his son comes to power, it doesn't go well at all. Verse 15, then the king of the north will come, pile up an assault ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. So that's Sidon in 198 BC. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops. So their lead general couldn't hold the city. He goes back to Egypt and actually put to death by them. This is the kind of character people have. For there will be no strength to make a stand. Verse 16. But he, Antiochus III, who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land. So here Jerusalem comes into the picture, the nation of Israel, Judea. So first time the Seleucids are ruling that area, and they're going to keep rule of that for some time. With this structure in his hand, he will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So another marriage alliance, this time initiated by the Seleucids. Antiochus III says, I'll give you my daughter, Cleopatra I, 9 years old, to marry the Ptolemy V, who is now about 15 years old when the wedding actually happens. So really a child marriage that was initiated a couple years before that is put in place, but Antiochus thinks this is going to help him out, but it actually doesn't, because Cleopatra I actually sides with Ptolemy, her husband, rather than with the Seleucids. Verse 18, then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. So he heads west into Asia Minor. He conquers territories that the Ptolemies had controlled, and eventually actually goes all the way into Greece, somewhat reluctantly, but emboldened by people in Greece. But a commander, this is a Roman commander, Lucius Scipio, will put a stop to his taunting against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his taunting. So not only stops him in Greece, but when Antiochus III goes back into Asia Minor, there's a battle there at Magnesia where Antiochus III is completely destroyed by the Romans, such that he has to start paying tribute to them. And verse 19 is the results of that. He's trying to find money to pay them this steep war debt. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and not be found. He actually was murdered when he was trying to rob a temple in Elam, one of his own territories. Then verse 20, so that's the career of Antiochus III, particularly its effect on the nation of Israel. Then in his place one will arise, so his son Seleucus IV, who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom, the nation of Israel. Yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger nor in battle. So he sends Heliodorus to steal from the temple, essentially. He doesn't succeed, but then Heliodorus decides to poison Seleucus IV. Supposedly he's going to be a regent for Seleucus' son, who's just a child at the time. Now Seleucus IV had sent his other son, Demetrius, in place of his brother, who becomes Antiochus IV, who had been a hostage to Rome. This was something they did to try to keep power of their tribute nation. So Antiochus IV had been a hostage in Rome. He was released because Seleucus IV had sent Demetrius, his son, there. When Antiochus IV hears that Heliodorus has poisoned Seleucus IV, he comes back and takes the throne by intrigue. He didn't actually have claim for it. Seleucus IV's son, one of the two sons, should have been the next king, not Antiochus IV. But Antiochus says, no, I'm going to take charge. So verse 21 says, in his place, Seleucus IV's place, a despicable person will arise, as Antiochus IV, on whom the majesty of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. This is the overall character, really, of this man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, God made manifest, is what he called himself. He made coins that said that. And the overflowing forcibly flooded away from him and smashed, and also the prince of the covenant. Now here we have the first touch on the high priest, the prince of the covenant. So Antiochus IV takes Onias, who was faithful to the Lord and wanted to be faithful to the law of Moses and the teachings that God had given in the covenant. He replaces him with his brother, Jason, who will go along with Antiochus IV's Hellenization program. But then eventually he's not satisfied with Jason's Hellenization and perhaps is offered more money by Menelaus. And so Menelaus is put in as high priest, even though he had no claim to it whatsoever. Onias opposes Menelaus and makes some accusations against him, and Menelaus chases him down and murders him. This is the character of these people. So Antiochus IV has now come to power. He decides he's going to attack the Ptolemies in Egypt, because that's what you do. Verse 25, because you always want more power because you're the best person that's come along. Verse 25, and he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. The king of the south will bring an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand because schemes will be devised against him. So now we're up to Ptolemy VI. Antiochus IV came to power in 175 BC. He attacks down into Egypt around 169 BC. Is successful to some measure, actually ends up capturing Ptolemy VI, sets up Ptolemy VI as king in Memphis because the court in Egypt had set up his brother Ptolemy VIII as the replacement for Ptolemy VI, who had been taken captive in Alexandria. So Antiochus IV sits down at the table with Ptolemy VI, says, listen, I'll get your kingdom back for you. And Ptolemy VI says, okay, yeah, that's great. So verse 26 says, those who eat his choice foods will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. So that's the failure of Ptolemy VI, and they replace him with Ptolemy VIII. Verse 27, as for both kings, so Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table. So they talk as if they're friends and they're going to work together, but they're not planning on that at all. Of course, if Antiochus had got Egypt, he would have claimed it for himself and not given it to Ptolemy VI. So, but Antiochus leaves. He doesn't have complete success in recovering it, and so he leaves. It says it will not succeed because the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land. So he's heading back up to Syria with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. So Antiochus IV is displeased with things that are going on in Jerusalem because evidently Jason had heard a rumor that Antiochus was killed in battle. So he had got troops together to fight against Menelaus. Antiochus finds out about that and just comes in absolute vengeance and massacres hundreds, thousands of people in Jerusalem. He set himself against the Holy Covenant. He then passes laws that you cannot be practicing Judaism. And he will take action and then return to his own land. Now, Ptolemy VI, within a few months, reconciles with his brother Ptolemy VIII as well as his sister. And they're back in charge down in Egypt there. They hadn't gone along, Ptolemy VI has not gone along with what he had committed to with Antiochus IV after all. So Antiochus IV is angry, he's going to come back down and fight again, verse 29. At the appointed time, now it's interesting to see these things like the appointed time because this shows the sovereignty of God in it all. God was still sovereign in all the details. At the appointed time, not that that's saying that these men weren't making their own decisions, right? They're making their own decisions. They're doing as they please, but God is still sovereignly, transcendently working in it. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south, but this last time will not turn out the way it did before. He's not going to have success. For the ships of Kittim, the Romans will come against him. And so this is the famous time when the Roman general draws a circle around Antiochus IV and tells him, listen, you need to make a decision before you leave the circle. Are you going to leave Egypt or are you going to fight Rome? In other words, you're not just fighting the Ptolemies, you're fighting Rome. That was a big deal. His father didn't have good success fighting Rome. And so Antiochus IV decides he's going to leave, and he's not very happy about that. So this is about 167 BC. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will withdraw in fear and will return and curse the Holy Covenant. So again, angry at Jerusalem and against the Lord, their God, and take action. So he will come back and pay attention to those who abandon the Holy Covenant. So the unfaithful to the Lord seem to be getting ahead and be rewarded by him. Well, they are at the time. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, so the desecration of the sanctuary, and do away with the regular sacrifice. So they're going to take away the sacrifice from the Lord, like was prophesied in Daniel chapter 8 as well. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. So he sacrifices a pig, an unclean animal in the temple, sets up, rededicates the temple to Zeus, obviously an idol, a false god, the abomination that makes desolate or creates horror. And by smooth words, so that incidentally, that action was on December 25th in 167 BC. And by smooth words, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. So he's going to pave the way that if you'll be unfaithful to God, it'll go well for you. And there are people that'll go along with that. They'll act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God, and the people that act wickedly evidently are not people that actually know God personally. Do you know God personally? They know their God. The people that know their God are in fellowship with a real God who they know personally, will be strong and take action. There's this strength comes from knowing God, depending upon a real God who you personally know, leading you to act differently than other people. In this particular time, the Maccabees stood up and after 3 years were able to cleanse the temple again, actually on December 25th, 164 BC. And those who have insight, or the wise among the people, will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. So even in the people that are seeking to be faithful to the Lord, they're going to have a lot of trouble in doing that for many days. Now, when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. The Lord's going to allow this turmoil to happen, and it's going to be happening, verse 25, and some of those who have insight will fall to refine, purge, and cleanse them. It's this benefit of refining, purging, and cleansing that he's bringing about. Daniel's thought, his concern, is there going to be a holy people that can actually go into the kingdom with the holy Son of Man? That'll be able to rule in a righteous kingdom. Yes, God is working that even in the midst of all the striving. And he's going to be doing that until the end time, verse 35. And so the text then projects far out into the end time because it is still to come at the appointed time. Verse 36, then at the end time, so we've gone long, far out into the future, then the king, so this isn't the king of the north or the king of the south. This is another king who thinks he's the king. He's the one that's going to rule the world. He's going to rule the whole thing. The king will do as he pleases. A lot like Alexander, remember, who did as he pleased. He's going to have great success in doing his own will. He's going to do as he pleases. He will exalt himself and boast against every god and will speak dreadful things against the God of gods. And this is just the same as Daniel chapter 7, that little horn who would boast against God. He will be successful. Terrible. He's going to be successful. But it's under the sovereignty of God. He'll be successful until the indignation is finished. God is using this to bring about judgment and even to smash the power of the holy people of God. Chapter 12. Verse 7. He'll be successful until the indignation is finished, because that which is determined will be done. And he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will boast against them all. He's God. But instead, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, precious stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god, perhaps referring to Satan himself. And he will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and he will make them rulers over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. So he's having great success. Again, this river's flowing again in the end time of a man who's striving to take over the whole world. Well, evidently he makes a covenant with the nation of Israel. Chapter 9, verse 27 says, remember, the people of the prince that shall come are going to destroy the city and the sanctuary, which happened in AD 70. So it wasn't the prince himself, but there was a future false prince that was going to come, and his people, evidently the Romans, destroyed the city and the sanctuary. Now he's come on the scene, chapter 9, verse 27, and this time paralleling it, and he makes a covenant with the Jewish people. The people are back in the land, but they're back in the land in unbelief and unfaithfulness to the Lord. And so they align with this king. They say, this seems to be the best plan, to go along with him. He's the one that's conquering, so let's go along with him. Sounds a lot like what they did with Antiochus III. And they think that that's going to work out, and it's going to seem to initially work out, because verse 40 says, and at the end time, the king of the south will wage war with him. So here come people from Egypt again, attacking up into Judea, and the king of the north will storm against him. So coming down into Judea, but they're coming against him, against the king. So the king has apparently come into the nation of Israel, into Judea, into Jerusalem area, and he's going to fight with these two kings. So it's not the king of the north or the king of the south, because he's actually fighting with them. And he's going to fight with them. He's going to have great success. The king of the north will storm against them with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he will enter countries, the king, the king, the little horn, or the false prince of chapter 9, and he will overflow them, pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land. So there he is in Israel. And many countries will fall, but these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. So those are off to the east of Israel. Then he will reach out with his hand against other countries. He's going to go down into Africa. The land of Egypt will not escape, but he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow us here. So he's conquering down to them. But there he's conquering, and rumors, verse 44, from the east, so this is farther east, and from the north, this is farther north than like Syria, so up into, say, Turkey, up into Russia. But rumors from the east and from the north will terrify him, and he will go out with great wrath to eliminate and annihilate many. Having had success in that battle, verse 45, he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. But as he set up his tent there, and he's ruling from Israel, we find that this is going to be the time when there's so much trouble, so much distress. Chapter 12, verse 1 says that Michael, your prince, is going to have to stand up to protect Israel from being completely annihilated by this man who thinks he's the king. Verse 12, chapter 12, verse 1. Now at that time, the end time, chapter 11, verse 40, when this king has come into the land and is conquering, at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. He's going to stand up to protect them from complete annihilation. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Now the Lord Jesus referred to that same thing. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, chapter 24, verse 15 of Matthew, flee, because there's going to be this time of distress that's unparalleled, a time of tribulation that's unparalleled. And so that time after the abomination of desolation is set up in the temple, in a holy place, there's going to be this great trouble for the nation of Israel in Judea, and it's almost complete destruction of them. Michael stands up to protect them. But it says at the end of verse 1, and at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. They'll be delivered. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, and these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. So resurrection is going to happen, connected with this deliverance that God is going to grant for the nation of Israel. There are indeed going to be holy, righteous, faithful people in the nation of Israel at that time, Daniel. They will be able to go into the kingdom that has been promised to your people and your city. Those who have insight will shine like the glow of the expanse of heaven. Those who lead the many to righteousness, notice there's going to be righteous people to be able to go into a righteous kingdom with the righteous Son of Man. Lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, keep these words secret and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will roam about and knowledge will increase. Now we get to kind of a tail end where it steps up from the details of that vision and even from the angelic conflict associated with it, and now looks again at the man above the river and asked him a critical question. Verse 5, then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the stream, the other on that bank of the stream. So he's back in his actual state at the Tigris River, this great river, and he sees two people standing on each bank of the river, Daniel himself standing on the bank. But it's pointed out now that the man dressed in linen was not on the bank of the river. He was above the waters. Someone said that a man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the stream. He's not in the waters. He's not subject to the waters of man's strivings. Isn't that wonderful? He's sovereign above them. Isn't it wonderful to know your God, to see him as transcendent? Doesn't that encourage you in depending upon him, in being strong and taking actions that you otherwise wouldn't take because you have such a God who's above the waters? How long will it be that he's asked? Until the end of these wonders. And I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, as he raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. So points towards heaven. That's where we want to have our thoughts, in heaven, where our God is. And swore by him who lives forever. See, this is the God who is not subject to man and their strivings, not even subject to angels, angelic conflict, because he's the God who lives forever, who's above it all, the sovereign one, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time, the same time frame that was given in chapter 7 and verse 25 about the time when the little horn would boast and would persecute the saints of God so severely. But ultimately, they would be rescued, chapter 12, verse 1, and they would be brought into the kingdom. But how is it that they're going to be a state that they're ready for that? This is what this man in linen is going to answer. It's going to be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish smashing the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. Remember, Daniel had been told there would be 77s until the atonement, until it's all brought to completion, until everlasting righteousness has come in for your people and for your city. Finally, it's going to come, and it's going to come at this culmination of the smashing of the power of the holy people. They're going to have to come to their complete end, like Daniel was on his face. They're going to have no strength in themselves, such that they look up on him whom they have pierced, Zechariah chapter 12. And they mourn for him. It's the day of atonement. They've come to this place of humbling themselves before God and begging him to save them. And so with them being in that state of recognizing that they did indeed need a Savior to die for their sins, and he's their only hope, they cry out for salvation, and he gives it to them. A fountain is open, Zechariah 13, verse 1, for forgiveness. And so then he does deliver them, Zechariah chapter 14, despite all this trouble and them being almost on the edge of complete obliteration. And God was sovereign over all of it. He was sovereign in it as well and through it. You know, all that strivings, God is going to succeed with Israel. He is going to succeed. There will be wise and righteous going into the kingdom with the Son of Man. Now, this is so strongly affirmed in Jeremiah 31, Jeremiah 33, in the midst of a wretched people. God is going to succeed at it. He is capable of taking dry bones and bringing them to life. There's nothing in them. This is the kind of God he is. And so he's going to do that. He's going to fulfill all his promises to his people, the nation of Israel, and he's going to set up Jerusalem as his center for a righteous kingdom upon the earth. Praise the Lord. And so Daniel, your concern, your mourning for 3 weeks, your burden, here's the answer to it. The Lord is sovereign above and through the strivings, and he will be successful in sanctifying Israel. This distress, this desolation has a destination. It's not to destroy, it's to deliver. It's to purify your people, verse 10. Many will be purified. The wicked will keep doing wickedly, but there'll be going to be many that will be purified. They're purified from their defilement, from their dirt, from their dross, and they will be in a state that they can rule with the Lord on the earth. The abomination of desolation that's set up in the middle of this 7-year period at the end of time, so 3.5 years, the times and half a time. The abomination of desolation is going to be set up, verse 11, and the regular sacrifice be abolished, but it's not forever. It's for a finite amount of time. In the end, the Lord's going to be successful. It's only going to be for 1,290 days. And how blessed is the one who is patient and attains to the 1,335 days, a month and a half later after that point. That God is going to be setting up things and all that they ought to be. There's blessing on the other side of this distress, of this trouble. And Daniel, you yourself, verse 13, you're going to rest, but you're going to rise for your allotted portion. That's a kingdom terminology. You have an allotted portion, a parcel, if you will, at the end of the age. What a blessing. What a motivation to stand with the Lord and to keep looking up. That as though there's wild times, though kingdoms rise and fall, though there's devious men, continue just the same, like Daniel did. Keep looking up and continue faithful to the Lord. May you be encouraged in depending on the faithful, sovereign, successful, sufficient God who's able to do all this in his mighty power, the Most High God, sovereign, wise, and good.